Mr. Jeff Hardcastle.
Yes. Hi. I don't have a webcam, so I'm doing this by phone, and Dee is helping me with changing my slides. If we can go to the next one, please. What I'm going to be covering is a little bit about COVID-19 and tourism. And as I listen to the presentations the past 2 days, it's pretty clear that we're all struggling with how to best model this, and some are getting way more into the weeds than I ever thought of getting. And I really appreciate the depth that Colby and other folks have done on looking at this topic. And then what I did for modeling the projections for Nevada this year, and how REMI does with modeling Nevada's projections in population growth, and a little bit about the 2020 census updates, since I mentioned that last year. Next slide, please. This just shows two maps comparing the spread of COVID back in May 27 and October 27th. May 27th, I pulled that map for a presentation with a state redistricting committee, just to show them just the national scope of this situation. But it has in many ways turned what are easy decisions tied to convenience and a general feeling of safety about our environment to making decisions, I think, a little bit harder to make. And this has impacted life in general and travel in a number of ways. Next slide, please. If you look at what's been put out by the Airlines for America, which is an industry trade group for the airline industry, they're projecting that there is at best a recovery to passenger levels of 2019 levels no sooner than 2023, as an optimistic scenario, 2024 in that range, and as a pessimistic scenario, not even recovering fully till past 2024. United Airlines, their chief executive officer, has said that he doesn't see the airline industry getting back to full capacity that they had in 2019 until possibly the end of the decade. Next slide, please. As others have mentioned, the hotel sector nationally is being impacted. It's not just limited to resort communities in the traditional sense like we have here in Nevada with Las Vegas and to some extent Reno and areas like Orlando. It's a national phenomena impacted both by business travel, but also tourism that goes to other destinations like Washington, D.C., New York City, Boston, Chicago, even national parks, those kinds of things where people are in hotels. Next slide, please. And there's going to be potentially outfall or fallout from the virus and how it's been impacting the economy here in Nevada. This is an example of how folks are starting to look at the larger impact. And this was done by the Gwen Center here in Nevada. It's showing somewhere between 270,000 to 320,000 potential folks being subject to eviction proceedings. The governor's moratorium on evictions ended October 15th, so we have yet to see the full fallout from the ending of that moratorium, but it is a fairly large chunk of our population that's subject to that. Next slide, please. And this chart here I stole from Brookings, and I have been looking at their website and others over time, but some states, as this shows, in Nevada's case, Florida's case, New York's case, New Mexico, Washington State, Hawaii, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts were much more exposed to small business losses potentially because of a lack of both income for small businesses, but also then lack of support from the payroll protection program. Next slide, please. And if you look at, this is a recent headline, Sheldon Adelson is talking about selling the Las Vegas Sands Hotel, which was basically built around a convention center model. He has a very large convention facility on site at the Sands, not just in conjunction with the more publicly owned Las Vegas Convention Center. But what he had said was, that struck me about this is that there's a need for government officials to first ease occupancy restrictions before trade shows and convention industry can make a comeback. And this is somewhat in contrast to the position being taken by the MGM company and by wind properties, where they're actually starting to tout that they can guarantee or try to facilitate some level of safety and interaction for folks by through testing and contact tracing on site at the property, and have a medical team there to provide supportive care if somebody does become sick with COVID. Next slide, please. And this is why I say I think this is fairly complicated to think about, because there's out there the public policy regarding capacity limits for different facilities. For instance, in Washoe County, we've gone scaled back from 250 maximum back down to 50-person maximum for events and large gatherings. And that's because we're having another spike in cases. But then there's also public policy regarding masks, that kind of thing. Then there's our individual actions and concerns where, early on in the pandemic, folks may have thought wearing a mask is going to be helpful. They might have started doing that before there was government intervention. There's also some evidence that as the talk about the virus was getting out there in the news media, folks were actually starting to curtail leisure and business travel, and you were starting to see that show up actually in open table data. And then there's the whole quarantine fatigue, business operations, inventory, and capital. Some businesses, had a surge of demand for certain goods. A real simple example, for instance, is with the grocery stores. There was, toilet paper made the big headlines, but yet yeast was also for a long time not available. Now, it's back available, but again, that idea of do you respond to that immediate surge that's panic buying, or do you anticipate this is going to be a fairly near-term, 1 year, 6 month, or 3 year phenomena? Then the behavior of other people, we may feel safe going out because we're wearing our mask and we're taking the right precautions, but then somebody in our office space or in the store doesn't exhibit that same behavior. That may be a friction force going out. And then there's the potential stress on the medical system of other public services. So just say that this is a government policy only situation, there's a lot of other factors I think that end up being considered as individuals make their decision to engage in economic activity, both as an employer or employee. Next slide, please. This is from a survey that was done by the website 538 in conjunction with IPOS, right when things were kind of first breaking out back in May. And at that time, they're asking people what would make them feel safe to go back to an event with any large attendance to it. And 51% said basically that the main driver for them would be that if there was a vaccine. Next slide, please. But that same survey had a question there, when should each sport team restart games or events? That is, when should your favorite baseball team or football team or soccer team that you watch and the teams that play against, when should they be starting to start back up? Well, the answer was 48% for the most part, across an average of 46% roughly, thought that the virus needed to be under control. But there was no definition what control means in that survey, unfortunately. But then there only 24% wanted, somewhere between 24, 26% wanted, felt that sports could restart if a vaccine was available. So that idea of control and feeling things are safe or normal may not be the same as necessarily having the public at large being vaccinated or a vaccine being available, because there's these other mitigation factors. Next slide, please. So I'm looking at Nevada. I ended up doing 3 scenarios. I did what I'm calling my traditional baseline, and then a COVID-19 best case scenario and a COVID-19 worst case scenario. And what I did was, in my thinking, I see this as a national setback or lack of demand and impact on primarily the hotel accommodations and amusement sector. and then I was looking also, Brookings did a very good job of reporting the impact on the creative arts sectors, and they actually show a very big drop in what would be the information sector. And so next slide, please. This just shows a table of how I grouped my different variables I used. But with my national baseline forecast I normally do, I use the employment update in there. And then for looking at employment in the COVID best case and COVID worst case, I use the employment output policy variable through 2022, and then with the worst case through 2024, and using that airline information and the hotel information, a magic 8-ball, a crystal ball, and a couple of other things I could figure out to look at to try to best gauge a percentage gain or loss change in those, primarily the hotel, accommodations and food sectors and the amusement sector, and the information sector for 2020. That information sector contains things like movies, production, those kinds of things, and some of those are actually coming back into play. The other thing I looked at too, though, at a national level, which REMI allows you to do through the national model, is international migration. And REMI has in the model built into it the REMI low scenario. Then there's this, but the Census Bureau's low projection is actually below the REMI low projection that's built into the model. And REMI's low projection actually outperforms the recent Census Bureau's estimate of that net international migration. And then the COVID best case scenario, I'm assuming that net international migration will effectively be a net zero for 2020 and 2021, and slowly ramp back up to that census low level. And then in the COVID worst case, where there's that prolonged, more of a prolonged slump in the industries, it's also going to be compounded because of, as Scott Nystrom was saying yesterday or on Wednesday, the impact on international migration that we're seeing from the policy changes that have gone on through the past 3 years, and potentially that lack of the United States being a pull destination and pulling people in from around the globe, for our migration change. The other thing I looked at in the COVID worst case scenario was this idea of labor force participation rates, because there's literature out there that COVID doesn't just impact people over 3 to 14 days or 21 days. There's now increasing literature about COVID long haulers, where there's long-term impact on either cognitive abilities, lung functionality, heart functionality. And so I readjusted the labor force participation rate nationally, dropping it down by 1% for the 18 to 64-year-old age group, and then 1.6% for the 65 and over. And within Nevada, I pretty much let the national model drive employment. I did do some residential adjusted, and then some retiree adjustment, just because the model tends to have in their retiree migration as a fixed effect. And then in both cases, I included the federal transfer payments from the first CARES Act stimulus. Next slide, please. And this just shows the different projections. As you can see, obviously the lowest population growth over the next 20 years is going to be with the COVID worst case. The best case scenario would be if the REMI low migration scenario was to be out there, and with the Census international migration and low projection, just as that baseline modified, with that only no changes to the COVID case, that is somewhat the middle ground in the COVID area. So that's why I used as my official projection for controlling for my age, sex, race, Hispanic origin estimates and projections. Next slide, please. And this just shows, if you look at and compared the REMI model as I adjusted the international migration and looked at it statewide, adjusting international migration in turn impacts economic migration into the state. And part of this is just for a couple of different reasons, and I'll show a graph that illustrates that. But part of it is the REMI model over time has shown a slowdown in the growth of our hotel gaming sector for the state. So part of it is being impacted by that. But the other thing is that drop down in international migrants or potential out-migration that the census no migration scenario actually shows is you're going to have a smaller pool of labor force population to draw in as economic migrants. And you're also going to be competing nationally, both with wages and the housing cost and potential job growth with other regions around the country for those economic migrants as our population growth slows down with less international migration. And that ripples into then the population estimates and projection that REMI has. Next slide, please. And this just shows the difference in the REMI models going forward from the last fiscal year of 2011, and then 2015, 2017, and 2018. You'll see that for the accommodations and food services sector, the last 3 years of history, the 15, 17, 18 I put in there to illustrate this point, tend to converge. There's a bit of a downward trend, though, in the 2018 years, last year of history. On the other hand, the 2011 series in there was in the model when I was looking at Tesla back at that time. Next slide, please. And one thing that's always been interesting in working with REMI, it was mentioned yesterday about how REMI doesn't, have a strong agricultural orientation, but also mining employment has tended to bounce around over different iterations of the model. In the 2011 model, you'll see that there was a downward trend that was below the long-term historic average going from 1990 to 2018. If you look at the 15 and 17 model, they were near term through about 2023, 2026, kind of in the same range, but then started diverging some. At least a fairly stable mining sector going forward. But then with the most recent iteration, the 2.4 model, with last history year of 2018, there's just a steep upward climb there. And I don't know how much that's an impact of the changing of using the GDP from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, but it was noticeable in this iteration of the model. Next slide, please. And this just shows the range of projections and the growth rates over time for Nevada. That I've been doing this since 2002 using the REMI model. And you'll notice that there was the spikes back in 2004, 2006, into 2008. That was when we were having the housing bubble. And that ramp up also too in the years prior to 2002 was the 90s when you had a large ramp up in the hotel gaming sector. But since 2011, there's been somewhat of a stable long-term projection in each iteration of these, and these are all 20-year horizons. Next slide, please. If you look at, though, how well REMI does, there's no real gold standard out there that addresses, like, this is a suggested or preferred range of error in projections. There was work out there in the demographic realm looking at population forecasts with looking at projections done both by the authors and other sources that looked at a range of potential errors by mean algebraic percentage error and mean absolute percent error. And so there's nothing there that says this is like a gold standard, this is what you should shoot for, this says it's good or bad. But if you look at REMI against that academic literature, it actually performs in long term with the projections since 11 through 19, which is a shorter horizon window, but it's actually performing pretty well for projecting at that time, 2019, well within the range of a fairly narrow error compared to what's in the literature there. And if you look at it in terms of taking out the outliers for longer term projections, it actually still is within a reasonable range of potential error there. So REMI actually does do a fairly good job as at least in projecting total population at a state level. Next slide, please. And as I said, I was going to update a little bit about the census. I mentioned it last year at the Users Conference with the idea of differential privacy. Since then, COVID-19 has probably impacted the data quality that we'll be seeing coming out of the census. Once COVID-19 really hit and started impacting the country as a whole, beginning roughly around the end of March, the first part of April, the Census Bureau went ahead and shut down operations for doing non-response follow-up as well as reaching out to rural communities. What then happened was they went to the Republican leadership in the census and in the Senate, and they asked for statutory relief to extend the deadlines for both preparing for gathering the data, but also then for producing the apportionment counts and the redistricting data, and not delivering the apportionment counts until April of 2021, and the redistricting data not until July of 2021. That would have bought them time to do two things. One would be to continue gathering data in the field with non-response follow-up and contacting rural areas and group quarters, that kind of situation. But it would also increase the time frame they had to process the data and do quality checking, do checks for duplicates, that situation. What ended up happening was they did not further pursue getting that statutory relief with the administration. And so they ended up announcing that they restarted the census and they were going to terminate any further field operations, that is, contacting folks, the door knocking, that kind of thing, by the end of September. There was a court case that started then going forward on the timing question. And that ended up keeping the field operations going till the middle of October. So now what would be a 6-month window, if everything had gone right, and there had been no COVID, what would have been a 6-month window for processing the census data, quality checking it, making sure things were counted properly and tabulated properly. That window now is shrunk now basically to 2.5 months. And there have been anecdotal stories out there and talking with my colleagues around the country about issues of folks not getting their census form for rural areas, non-response follow-up. There's rumors out there of either folks not being contacted at all or a high reliance on administrative records, which will degrade the data quality for things like control totals for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the American Community Survey, those kinds of issues or topics. And then there's also out there still the court case on including citizenship in the apportionment count. And beyond that, then there will be, at this time, still going forward with the idea of differential privacy and putting noise into the data to protect privacy. The Bureau did do a workshop in the end of last year in December and did start working with the National Academies of Sciences and had some work groups looking at how to best gauge what is the best privacy loss budget and the impact of that on the data. And that's been being reviewed against what was the 2010 census and then rerunning that with the differential privacy in there. And the 2010 census was the best census out there. So it's still unclear as to what the impact will be on data quality, with that baseline data that impacts the research that we all do going over the course of the decade. And with that, I look forward to questions when the panel takes questions. Thank you for your time.